Okay, so I guess the ultimate goal of investigations within this field of cultural transmission is to understand however we got from this particular stage to this particular stage. So I guess people working in the field of primatology often would tend to focus a lot on the similarities between humans and primates. However, I think it's important to notice the tremendous differences. Now we know that genetically we are not maybe that different. We also know that there are a lot of aspects of cognition and behavior that are comparable. Yet, I guess we organize ourselves in this very, very complex way, in very, very complex social structures. We surround ourselves by very complex material culture, right? Artifacts and structures. One kind of important observation in this regard is that even if we see some rudimentary examples of tool use in the animal kingdom, often what happens with animal species using some kind of tools is that they find the perfect tool, they use it throughout the day, and then they throw it over the shoulder, and next day they go to look for new tools. While we seem to not exactly do the same, although it happens. We have evolved an amazing ability to accumulate culture. That is to actually continuously refine our technologies and develop them, and we do that by inheriting, stand on the shoulder of our ancestors and our previous generations, and continue for wherever they go. And one thing that is super interesting about these differences and this kind of particular special trajectory that is the very fast evolutional path that we have taken. One kind of last way to think about this difference, I'm suddenly reminded, is that I guess while we usually talk about biological evolution as a game which is about adaptation to an environment, I guess what is really special about humans is that we have kind of taken that and turned it on its head. So we rather build environments that fits us, right? So that's an amazing accomplishment. Okay, so the speed by which this development has happened is often noticed, because it seems that we've been around for quite a while, millions of years, but the kind of advances that we have seen in cultural evolution has happened over actually quite a short time frame of only maybe 200,000 years. This poses some really important questions in terms of what brought us here, like what are the kind of underlying mechanisms that could ever bring about these particular developments. And it's pretty clear that something like we have observed here recently is happening much too fast to kind of match the frame of pure biological evolution, right? So biological evolution is very slow. So if we are to understand what is going on continuously also now, I guess we cannot allude to a pure biological explanation. Of course, there are studies that have suggested some kind of connection between, for instance, brain size and technological innovations. However, it's clear that while brain size seemed to have evolved in a much more linear, slow way kind of stuff that has enabled us, or the kind of way that has facilitated us, seems to be a much more kind of exponential and non-linear trajectory, which kind of has led to the suggestion that we might be facing some kind of very minimal biological adaptation that has happened at some point, which have had tremendous consequences or have enabled totally new ways, new kind of behaviors and new cognitive abilities, right? And often the kind of general concept that is used to try and capture something like what is happening here is a step from talking about biological evolution to talk about cultural evolution. And in particular, I guess the notion often used in this field is this concept of cumulative cultural transmission as kind of a key to understand this unique evolutionary trajectory. And let's just break this down a moment from the last word first. So what is understood by the word transmission is some form of learning, some form of sharing knowledge among individuals, and that would be kind of one of the themes that kind of go through the day. If we take the next concept here, cultural, what is important here is exactly this observation that we have to go beyond a purely biological frame of investigation. It's clear that what we observe here are mechanisms that we cannot reduce to simple biological adaptations on kind of the individual level, but there's some kind of stuff happening that on a population level, probably related somehow to our particular way of being social. So there's something about this transmission that enabled through different ways of social perception, social interaction and instruction, and so on and so forth. And let's take the last concept here, the concept of accumulation. So, as I alluded to in the very beginning, this is really about capturing this particular aspect of human culture, the fact that whenever we make new innovations, whenever we develop practices, skills, produce new knowledge, this knowledge is not just lost when we cease to be. It's rather accumulated through our society. We have this amazing ability to stand on the shoulder of earlier generations and keep on refining our technologies in ways that we do not really observe in the animal kingdom. And that has often been termed the ratchet effect. So a ratchet is kind of a little thing like this that every time it turns it kind of doesn't go back, right? And this is the analogy to try and capture this particular aspect of culture, that whenever we have invented some kind of new technology, the next generation doesn't have to kind of start over from scratch, but can kind of build on top of that, refine it and develop it. So this is, I guess, the basic idea about this particular concept of accumulation. Now, today, I guess that we'll be visiting different concrete investigations into cumulative cultural transmission, and there I've kind of identified three main topics that seems to organize this field. They're very related though, but one kind of particular set of questions regards the way in which we have developed tools, pragmatic instrumental tools and artifacts, technologies that we can apply in order to change our environment, construct new environments, and so on and so forth. Another set of questions target ways in which we, along the way, also have formed new symbolic tools. These are slightly different. They do different kind of work. They do not change the material environment as such, but they enable us to, for instance, share skills and knowledge. And it seems that even if some of the mechanisms behind these are comparable, there's also slightly different observations being made in these two domains. And then I think there's another important set of questions that target rather the way in which we organize ourselves in the social domain, so how we structure our social world in terms of societal structures, rituals, religions, and so on and so forth, that do not really pertain only to the two previous ones here. But I suspect that today mostly we'll hear about these two. Maybe mostly about this one. Okay, so one of the next kind of important aspects of the overall topic for today will be this idea about taking these kind of big questions that belong to really long timescales into the laboratory to see if we can gain new knowledge about it. And I guess why should we want to do that? So the kind of evidence that we can collect in the wild could be, for instance, archaeological records. So we do have a lot of really rich archaeological records that, from which we can reconstruct much of what has been going on. We can kind of map a particular developmental trajectory through the years. And here we have some of the really early archaeological findings that seem to be indicative of some kind of early cognitive engagement with symbolic structures, for instance. And there are all kind of studies that try and bridge some of these more observational findings with ideas about how cognitive evolution has evolved. So that we have kind of one set of evidence that can inform discussions of cumulative cultural evolution. Then we have another set of evidence coming from, for instance, primatology. So a lot of studies have been made where we have given really hard tasks to animals. So both, of course, there are studies of animal learning and tool use in the wild, but also these kind of laboratory studies where we are comparing how, for instance, children and chimpanzees go about solving particular questions that often seem to imply kind of complex cognitive operations. And some of these studies are trying to investigate exactly how much a chimp can learn. Here's one particular example for Susaus Rombert's lab. So this is not very loud, but can you put some soap on the ball?
That's a good job. That's very nice. Thank you. Can you put the pine needles in the refrigerator?
Can you put the pine needles in the refrigerator? So, this is supposedly showing us. oh, winter again, is that Kanti is actually able to pass even quite complex syntactical sentences that he has never heard before. So he is able to, in a productive way, to combine words and into new constructions, and actually has quite a good understanding of, yes, this is definitely stuff that he has never done before. Yeah. And I guess the point is to investigate, so what are the biological and cognitive limits of our closest ancestors, like chimps. Yet another scene for doing investigations is these very, very interesting studies of new emerging languages. So it happened quite recently, I think now 40 years back or so, that they decided in Nicaragua to gather deaf people from all kind of provinces and make the first school for deaf people in Nicaragua. Before that, I guess deaf people were kind of left to themselves and often would kind of manage with some very rudimentary, simple gestures and signs with that maybe only their local, very local community and or their family would understand. But what happened 40 years back was that suddenly a lot of deaf people were gathered in one place in a new established school, and we have kind of quite great records, quite detailed records of a new language emerging more or less spontaneously. Even if there were some plans of trying to design a sign language, a Nicaraguan sign language, that was kind of not what happened. Rather, the language kind of grew out of the interactions among people who came to this school, and it seemed that actually spontaneously, even complex grammatical phenomena has evolved over the years. So now we have kind of a full-fledged language that, which is really a rare thing. Then I guess lastly, of course, it has been suggested that maybe we can go and study ontogenetic development in order to gain some insights into some stages that could have some analogies, similarities to what have happened also in historical time, that is in time related to phylogenetic development. So, for instance, we see that whenever infants learn to speak, they often have stages where they would produce sounds that are kind of to be understood holistically to mean kind of a full proposition. And some researchers have speculated that probably what we see there or that kind of could suggest how, for instance, some of our early symbolic behavior also moved through stages towards becoming more analytic and more compositional and so on and so forth. I think the important lesson here is today would be to discuss what it is that we cannot learn from these various existing pieces of evidence which have this kind of slightly more descriptive, observational nature. So when we dig into the archaeological records or we study chimpanzee behavior, it's often hard to really individuate some of the driving factors behind. Now it says language evolution here, but it could definitely also be other aspects of cultural development. So we might observe stuff that could possibly be due to biological adaptations. We observe stuff that is quite possibly due to cognition and learning, social interaction, maybe influences of the environment. But often, even if we have kind of put our various theories to work here, it can be difficult really to decide whether one or the other factor here is kind of the more critical or decisive, play a more critical or decisive role. And one example is, for instance, that the Nicaraguan Sign Language has been treated as evidence for very, very, very diverse theories about language evolution. So if we look into the Wikipedia, how the Wikipedia treats the innateness hypothesis of language evolution, they kind of point to the Nicaraguan language as a good piece of evidence for the innateness of language, while if we go and read Tomasello, he would say that, oh, the Nicaraguan language proves that language evolves through interactions and is a cultural innovation rather than a set of biological capacities. So I guess we are left with these questions pertaining to what kind of factors contribute, what is really kind of the critical mechanism driving something like cumulative cultural transmission. And this is where, I guess, if ever we are interested in something like causality or mechanisms, underlying mechanisms, I guess, the experiment is a good place to start, right? Experiments can help us unpack some of this complexity. So what happens in the experimental studies is that we take these phenomena into the lab where we can kind of control, keep a handle on these different interacting factors, and then we can start to manipulate individual factors and keep everything else stable to see, do we observe some of these aspects of cultural transmission unfold in ways that kind of match up with the observations that we have made through the other types of evidence. So in lab studies of cultural transmission, what happens is often that we try to simulate processes of cultural transmission in a lab. That is, even if those, like the phenomena that we want to study actually belongs to very long time scales, we try to create artificial situations where we kind of speed up cultural history. We bring in, of course, cognitively modern participants. Often we give them quite simple tasks, and we give them, of course, a much shorter time frame in order to solve these tasks. However, because we often kind of introduce contrastive conditions, that is, we make some people do the experiment under some conditions and other participants under other conditions, we are still kind of in a situation where we actually are able to make comparison and say, oh, it seems that some factors here might be more critical than others. A lot of different type of experiments have been conducted over the last 10 or 20 years, something like that. And there will be some concepts popping up again and again during the day that I thought we could just as well introduce. So one of the kind of very basic set of concepts here kind of target the structure of the transmission process itself. And here often we've distinguished between what we call horizontal transmission. And horizontal transmission is thought to be kind of a simulation of the interaction or the transmission that happens within one generation. So it's really focused a lot on interaction among people belonging to the same generation or society. And often the kind of experiments, they take various forms, but it could be a situation in which we have some kind of participant A who interacts with participant B in trial 1 here, and C interacts with D, and in trial 2 they get a new task, and so on and so forth. And what we then can observe is, so what happens to some kind of particular aspect of symbolic communication, or some particular way of of doing cultural artifacts as a function of repeated interactions within a society or within a bunch of individuals. This can be contrasted to a different type of perspectives, often alluded to as, or referred to as vertical transmission, and that is experiments that try to simulate the transmission between generations. So, situation in which a participant kind of has evolved some kind of skill that is then passed on to his offspring, or a different one here, offspring, then through numerous generations, in order to investigate what happens as a consequence of this kind of serial learning, the fact that we learn from someone that learns from someone that learns from someone, and so on and so forth. These are kind of the most basic forms that have been used in experiments, and of course one could immediately notice that maybe they are both kind of not the best simulations of what actually goes on, and but they are good for individuating particular critical parameters. So these have been extended, for instance, to situations where you could imagine having a generation that go and interact with each other and maybe form some kind of new communication system, something like that. Then someone dies, in this particular case A dies, but there's also a new guy coming in here, and so on and so forth, simulating this continuous replacement of individuals where some people kind of carry on the conventions and traditions and innovations from generation to generation. This is also a kind of a structure that has been used in many of these types of experiments. Here yet again is another one. We could also, rather than study how two individuals repeatedly do the same task over many trials, we can try and simulate what happens in a small society where the same people go and interact with each other. So in this particular instance here we have A interacting with B and C with D and so on and so forth. But it might be that a bit later actually A is interacting with B and B is interacting with C and so on and so forth. What can happen in these community type of designs is that if someone gets a really clever idea, finds a good solution for some particular problem, they can kind of bring it on and let that idea propagate in the community. So already here at the next set of interactions, it kind of is spreading, and actually A and B will go on and interact with new people, but also now D and C can carry those innovations or those ideas or those optimal solutions on to yet other individuals in this community, which means that we can see a whole kind of community converging on this optimal solution to some problems. So this has been used to study the spread and conventionalization of cultural practices within a closed community. Now this pertains to very structural things about how people interact and what exactly type of situation we want to manipulate. The other questions concern then what kind of particular mechanisms are in focus, right? So what is it what kind of mechanism would we like to individuate? And there's a whole long list there, and I'll only just give a few examples. But for instance, there's a lot of studies that have been interested in the particular contribution of cognitive biases and how the constraints that our cognitive system is is putting on aspects of learning and transmission. In these type of experiments, often some kind of quite complex, maybe slightly random input is given to people. They have to keep it in their head, maybe for kind of a minimal time frame, and then reproduce it. And often what we see is that since people have difficulty remembering random stuff, they tend to kind of, even if they really try hard to reproduce the input, they kind of try to often come to distort it a little bit. And often that these distortions, these mistakes that people make, seem to push the system in the direction of some kind of emerging order. So we see that if you want to teach people a new language that consists of very random mappings between sounds and meanings, actually when they later have to recall these, they, even if they do their best, they tend to induce elements of order and stuff, which is an interesting aspect of how cognition works. That it seems to shape whatever we do in even at a very basic level, in order to make it easier to learn and to store and so on and so forth. That has been studied in these kind of vertical transmission diffusion chain studies, where a bit like the children's game of Chinese Whisper, where someone is taught some kind of language and then have to reproduce it. That language that the person is reproducing is then the training set for the next participant who has to learn that, and so on and so forth. And what happens is often that these very subtle cognitive biases that seems to relate to the way that our memory, for instance, works, tend to have this capacity to shape a language from a kind of more random, unstructured input to become, in the end of the generation. So if these small, subtle biases work at every stage here, they kind of, at every generation, push the language towards becoming more and more structured and more ordered. So that's kind of one set of factors that seems to be at stake here. Also, the same basic experimental methods have been used to study this idea about accumulation of skill and technologies and innovations in order to simulate this kind of process of tools that become increasingly refined. As some of the interesting experiments in this regard has, for instance, taking spaghetti and marshmallows and giving them to people, and then they have to build towers, the highest possible towers. Then that is passed on to the next generation that has to refine that those skills and technologies. And we see kind of actually how people accumulate skills and knowledge that enable them to build higher and higher towers through generations. Same has been studied with paper airplanes, for instance, or different kind of sample technologies that are thought to illustrate these things. Another set of factors that has been manipulated in these experiments, and I think we'll hear more about that during the day also, is different types of transmission or learning. So for instance, we can learn by simply observing someone else from a third person distance, right? We can learn from imitating or emulating others, but we can also learn, and that's something that is more specific, I guess, to modern humans, that we can actually learn by actively instructing someone else, or through bidirectional interactions, for instance, symbolic or verbal interactions, which seems pretty special to humans. And it has been suggested in experimental studies that if we are in a situation that includes some element of verbal teaching and interaction, then that greatly enhances the the transmission of skill, for instance, over generations. Now, these are a few examples to kind of give you an idea about both why we should go and study these things in the lab, but also kind of what could be a few of the central questions that you might want to go and investigate in the lab. What I would like us to do here in the last minutes is a little practical exercise where we'll try out what it's like to be in an experiment. And this is a little study where we're going to create not just one new language, actually we're going to create 2 new languages in here during the next 10 minutes or so. I'll distribute some materials here. The idea would be that that you each get a sheet like this one. When you get it, please bend it over like this so that your partner cannot see this lower part here. The idea is that you kind of pair up 2 and 2 people who are going to interact together in order to solve a set of small problems here. And the way it works is very simple. You have to communicate concepts to each other. These are the kind of concepts that you have to communicate. You have to take turns. And this is the part where you have to be very attentive and careful because my students often mess this up. In a moment I'm distributing these papers here, right? One of you will be participant A, another one will be participant B. If you're participant A, you start. You look down here and you notice that you have to communicate concept number 2 to your partner. You can do that using gesture, but you're not allowed to use any words. And you're not allowed to use any kind of conventional signs like letters or numbers. When you have gestured your partner, then over here, look at these pictures and make a guess that she notes down here the number of that. Might be that she actually made a correct guess, then she writes 2 here. And then what happens is that now your partner has to gesture, right? So we are kind of moving in this zigzag fashion here. And your partner looks here, 4, and then gestures this, and now you write your guess here, and so on and so forth. And after that, it's your turn again, so you kind of pass through this schema like this. Let's try that out. I'm going to divide you into 2 conditions. I think we'll split here. So can you help distribute these?
Are we only doing the top one, or are we also doing the bottom one?
You're doing these ones which are... Oh yeah, so you just continue down here, yeah, and then I'll probably... maybe I should actually not put it up.
Yeah.
Some of you might have a great memory. So it will be participant A.
Memory.
Can you find that?
No, I just
It's one.
Yeah. Oh, so these are conditions. Now you're messing things up.
Oh! Somebody messed it up. The real world.
That doesn't matter too much. So let's be...
Okay, I have a participant B.
What about the team up here?
Så skal du bare kommunikere noget til mig. Jeg ved ikke, hvad det er.
Everybody have a partner now? When you come to me.
Ja.
At least a start because I guess we're already running late.
Oh, you know this one, exactly.
Yeah, many of my.
Then you're fine. Guys, do you need help?
I just want a second.
Yeah, we did like with this with exactly this. So now we need to have shortcuts to like explain this to others. So now it's like so we're sort of used to like a certain part. Yeah. We just need to be matched for the column. So you do this, and then write mine here, and then I do mine. That's what they
En maskine vil jeg sige. Klar.
Okay.
mine.
No.
Sorry. Amen.
Oh no, I actually did a long one. Okay, can you do that one?
We needed to be quiet otherwise.
Oh, okay. You both live. Getting better. Oh, yeah, that's oh, wow, this is weird.
Oh no, it's your place. Okay.
I can't see one like that.
Okay, in the interest of time, let's stop it there. Was it fun? Okay, so some of you, of course, some of you tried this before, so you know that it's really not about getting it right. So you can compare, of course, but it's not supposed to be a hard task. Rather, actually, this task is all about studying how something like linguistic structure can spontaneously emerge out of these types of interactions, right? So some of you had this particular item in your set. How did you communicate this particular concept? This particular?
I don't think it's bananas.
Didn't you have the banana? Yeah, so you might have been in a different condition, right? Some of you were in the condition. So, Carsten, how did you, your group?
The feeling action.
Yeah, but the kind of the overall, the whole.
The whole one.
Yeah.
So the individual first. With the dancing action.
Yeah, you did some kind of ballerina thing.
And in the end, it was reduced to just lifting an arm. and the banana, the object.
And then you threw it. Okay.
In the end.
Is that kind of other people who were in this condition? Did you do something along those lines? Yeah.
We did the hair and stuff.
Yeah, you did the hair. Okay. But interestingly here, I guess even if many of you are Danes and you speak a language that follow the structure of SVO, that is the subject, the verbal phrase and the object, you kind of arrived at a different structure, linguistic structure here. First gesturing the agent, then the object, and then in the end the verbal phrase or the activity. Now there was a different condition. Also, some of you had this item in your list. How did you communicate this particular item? So maybe yeah. How would you go about doing that? Yeah, so ballerina, knitting.
Put the shirt on.
So you did the agent, then the activity, and then the object in the end, which is kind of interesting, right? That follows exactly the SVO structure that we, for instance, have in Danish. So did other people in this particular condition do something along those lines? Yeah? Yeah? So it seems that in here in this classroom, 2 different languages evolved through the last kind of 10 minutes. One that has one particular word order and a different language that has particular other word order, even if these are simple transitive sentences, right? Both of them. Now this experiment we conducted and it was informed by a study that came out a few years back in PNAS, where it was actually observed that irrespective of what kind of language people would speak, if they were asked to gesture these kind of simple transitive scenarios, they tended to go for the SOV solution, which was kind of interesting. So here we have the proportion of SOV in different languages, such as Turkish and Chinese and English and Spanish. And we see that at least in English and Spanish, we tend to have an SVO structure, that is first the agent, then the verbal phrase, and the patient or the object in the end. However, when shown these small pictures and asked to gesture, people went directly for the SOV solution, and it was kind of suggested here that we might have some kind of deep, maybe even genetically coded bias towards SOV, that is kind of the more fundamental, natural way of representing events. We had a student who was kind of provoked by this idea and wanted to challenge it. So, and that has now come out in this study that you can look up, where we actually have 3 experiments that target this problem from different angles. But the main idea is that it might be that this is not really something that comes out of some deep cognitive bias. Rather, when we observe certain types of events in the world, they seem to already have some structure in them. So if you have a situation where someone is manipulating an object, the object somehow has already to be there in order to be manipulated. So if you want to throw a paper airplane, you need it there before you can actually throw it, and that is kind of different from another type of event that we can observe in the world. So some events in the world have a different structure. There, actually, in order for an object to come into existence, you have to do something, right? So there are these object construction events where we bake cakes, or we make sandcastles, or we paint, or we knit, and as a consequence of our action, the object come into existence. And that is actually some structure that we can observe out in the world. So I guess what we suggested with this study was that actually we might, in this particular case, be looking at a situation where the structure comes from the environment rather than from deep cognitive biases. So we did this experiment, had people gesturing through numerous trials, and actually what we observed was exactly the same phenomenon that we were able to replicate. It seems in here today that whenever people were shown these manipulation events, they went for SOV. So they kind of spontaneously made that their preferred syntax for gesturing these types of events. But if they were shown a different stimulus set of object construction events, then they spontaneously formed a little language, a little syntax that followed the structure of SVO. So this was just kind of to show how we can actually use small games and experiments to inform discussions of where these innovations come from, what kind of impact, what kind of factors might play a role. In this particular case, we kind of concluded that actually the environment itself, so if we are in an environment that has certain kind of resources available, has certain structures, that those might influence us to, of course not suggesting that maybe Danes and English-speaking are in a situation with more construction events, but it's more kind of a proof of concept here. I've already been talking much too much, so but with it I'll conclude and then we'll pass on to some of the meat of the day.